Imagine, you are a talented engineer. Yesterday you were praised for an outstanding idea, and today you are arrested for sabotage. You are accused of deliberately slowing down the construction of an important plant, or even trying to destroy the country's economy. Sound like a bad dream? But that's exactly how hundreds of engineers in the USSR lived in the 1930s. In those years, Stalin conceived ambitious projects to build hydroelectric power plants, railroads, factories, and cities. One of these projects was the White Sea Canal. Its construction required thousands of specialists, but few people know that many engineers who worked on the canal were there not of their own free will. They were arrested and sent to camps under threat of execution. They had to work in inhuman conditions to avoid death. So why exactly were engineers the first suspects of sabotage? There was a special target on them. It was believed that technical specialists were too smart and could covertly sabotage industrialization plans. As a result, over 40% of those accused of sabotage were engineers. That's thousands of lives ruined by suspicion and fear. But the real reason for this repression is far more complex and darker. Why did an engineer who helped build bridges and factories suddenly become an enemy of the people? Why did the success of these people become a death sentence for them? The truth about repressions against engineers is not just frightening, it turns the idea of those years upside down. After all, not only the fate of individuals, but also the future of the entire country depended on these events. Why did engineers, the people who created factories, roads, and power plants, become the main enemies in the eyes of the authorities? Did their knowledge and skills cause Stalin to fear them? To understand this, we need to look at the atmosphere that prevailed in the country in the late 1920s and early 1930s. After the revolution, many engineers were educated and experienced in Tsarist Russia. They built factories and developed technologies, but in the new Soviet society, such specialists seemed suspicious. The authorities did not trust people with a past associated with pre-revolutionary orders. It was believed that engineers could work for the enemies of the country, capitalists or foreign intelligence agencies. An example of such distrust was the famous Shakhtinsky case in 1928. Then 53 engineers of the coal industry were accused of espionage and sabotage. They were allegedly recruited by foreign intelligence to sabotage the work of the mines. Fantastic accusations were made at the trial. The engineers deliberately spoiled equipment, slowed down coal production, and even caused accidents. Most of the accused were sentenced to death or long terms in camps. Suspicion was reinforced by another detail. Engineers had great prestige in society. They were respected for their knowledge, and the success of the entire industrialization depended on their work. But under conditions of total control, such independent figures were dangerous for the regime. The authorities feared that engineers could use their skills against the state. There was a real hunt for pests. For example, engineers could be arrested for any error in calculations, even if it was accidental. It was considered that it was not a mistake, but deliberate sabotage. Such accusations ruined fortunes and hindered the country's development. But is it possible to build the future without trust in the people who create it? It is hard to believe, but the destruction of engineers was one of the reasons for many failures of the first 5-year period. How did the repression of the country's brains affect its heart? Industrialization. Next, you will learn at what price the USSR paid for the fear of its own talents. Imagine, you are summoned for interrogation, and you don't know whether you will return home. You are told that your work for the good of the country is actually sabotage. They offer you to sign a confession to crimes that don't exist and promise that your family will remain safe. What do? Most engineers signed these documents, but they were still sent to camps or executed. This is how the repression machine worked in the USSR. Engineers were arrested on false accusations, often without any evidence. Trials began with an investigation that could hardly be called fair. During interrogations, they were tortured, they were beaten, not allowed to sleep, and their loved ones were threatened. Once a design engineer said that he was forced to sign a confession under the threat that his wife would be arrested as an accomplice. After the confession, the trial would begin. But these were not real trials, but show trials. At such trials, the accused were made out to be enemies of the people who had to be convicted. The verdict always sounded loudly, so that the others realized the authorities would not spare anyone. For example, in one trial, railroad construction engineers were accused of deliberately slowing down cargo deliveries. This was explained by the fact that they allegedly worked for foreign agents. The trial took place in front of hundreds of people, so that every engineer knew that the slightest mistake could cost lives. Most of the accused were killed despite promises to keep their families safe. Even after confession, they were often shot. It didn't matter to the authorities whether a person was guilty or not. The main thing was to create an atmosphere of fear. The conclusion from this is simple but bitter. The real purpose of such trials was not to punish the guilty, but to paralyze the entire intelligentsia with fear. Talented people were afraid to take the initiative lest they become suspicious. But what happened to those who survived? Why did they return from the camps broken and were never the same again? The following is a look at how the repression affected the country's life and its future. The destruction of engineers, people who knew how to build and develop the country, turned into serious problems for the entire economy. One of the most striking examples was the delay in the construction of the purge, a huge hydroelectric power plant that was supposed to be a symbol of industrialization. The project was originally designed by experienced engineers, but after their arrests, the process slowed down dramatically. The young specialists who replaced them could not cope. The result, the deadline for the commissioning of the object was delayed, and in the construction itself, many mistakes were discovered, which had to be corrected in subsequent years. Another example is the factories in Magnitogorsk. Their construction began as the pride of Soviet industrialization. But after repressions against engineers, the work practically stopped. The factories were completed only in the 1940s, and that at great expense. As a result, the country lost years and millions of rubles that could have been spent on other needs. Repressions did not just slow down construction. They created an atmosphere of fear that made specialists afraid to propose new ideas. Young engineers, seeing the fate of their older colleagues, preferred to keep quiet even if they knew how to improve projects. This led to the fact that Soviet industry lagged behind in many areas, losing competitiveness. As a result, repressions against engineers hit not only those who ended up in prisons or camps. They slowed the development of entire industries, setting back the country's economy for decades. Moreover, many of the destroyed projects had to be redesigned, which cost additional resources. And yet, the worst thing is not the lost years and money. The worst part is the destruction of trust. People who could have changed the country for the better were broken or killed. Can we call this the price of progress? Or was it a path in the opposite direction? The story of the repression of engineers is not only a tragedy of individuals, but an important lesson for anyone who wants to understand how fear and distrust can destroy a society. These events clearly show how dangerous it is to destroy those who create the future. After all the arrests, torture, and deaths, rehabilitation began in the 1950s. The surviving engineers were found innocent. It was supposed to be an act of justice. But can the years they spent in the camps be brought back? Can their shattered lives be rebuilt? According to historians, the country lost about 70% of its technical elite. These people could have built bridges, designed factories, developed technology. Instead, they ended up in prison or were killed. and their place was taken by inexperienced cadres who had to learn on the fly, making mistakes.